So the question then, and I think this is kind of what you want to talk about, is what is facing Andy Burnham when he becomes Prime Minister, and what will his leadership look like?
So the big question, which is on lots of people's lips this morning now, is where does the Burnham versus the markets battle end up? So you remember that last year he wrote an article which said we shouldn't be in hock to the bond markets, and lots of people criticised that, and then he kind of backtracked a bit. He also at one point said he didn't really agree with the fiscal rules. He was going to rip those up. And then he said he was going to obey the fiscal rules. And it does seem that there's a real inability on the part of the ruling class, if you want to call it that, to stand up to markets. So why is that? That's what I want to talk about, is why is that and where might it end up?
So what are these fiscal rules then? These are rules that Rachel Reeves came up with herself?
Well, some of them have been a bit more long-standing than that. So, the Tory government had the fiscal rules as well. So there's a fiscal stability document, agreement that was signed, I think, in autumn last year, which set out these three rules. And the three rules are they're couched in very technical language, but they are fairly straightforward. One is that you will balance the books. So you will make sure that your income is at least equal to your expenditure by the end of a kind of 3-year period. And in Rachel Reeves's budget, that does happen. It's right towards the end of the 3-year period. So that's the first rule. The second rule is that you will reduce overall debt. So those two kind of go together, really. Because
surely if you're,
you can't reduce debt. If you're doing one, you should do the other. Yeah, absolutely. Unless you use that surplus to do something else. But
like what? Because then wouldn't it become expenditure?
Build a hospital.
Would that not be classed as expenditure?
It would, and this is some of the things I want to come on to as to whether that's sensible for it to be just classed as expenditure. But yeah, those two rules go together. I think balancing the budget and paying down the debt, which I think people can kind of grasp that those make a lot of sense. And there's also a third one that people don't talk about very much, which is there's a cap on welfare spending. It's not all welfare spending comes into that cap, but it's something like 200 billion maximum spend on welfare, some aspects of the welfare spend.
And what would go underneath? Like what would that be
things like predictable welfare spending, so pensions, things that are coming. But if there were a rise in universal credit because there were a downturn, that's not included, but most welfare payments are included in that.
Is pensions welfare?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I would argue that pensions are an entitlement that you've built up by paying your national insurance contributions, but they're under the welfare budget, you might say. So those are 3 fiscal rules. Why do we have those fiscal rules? Well, partly because markets would object if we don't. And I think you might remember some of these numbers from when we did the videos on the budget earlier this year. So, was it last year?
Last year.
That was last year, wasn't it? Yeah.
November, I think.
Yeah. So we spend about 125 billion on servicing our debt.
Yeah, just explain that for people if they're not aware.
So we owe the total amount that we owe to, because the government has borrowed that money from the markets. And our total borrowing is something like 95% of GDP. So it's just under 3 trillion. I was going to say billion then, 3 trillion. Our GDP is just over 3 trillion. So those things are quite close to each other. That's our total GDP. And what we do to borrow that money is the government issues a bond, we call it gilt, that goes on the market and people buy that gilt. And then the government...
IOU.
It's an IOU. Yeah. And the government then promises as part of that IOU, I will pay you each year a certain amount of dividend interest on that IOU. So the rate at which bonds trade is an indication of the rate at which people are willing to lend money to the government.
Yeah.
And that at the moment, I think on Friday, it ticked up a bit to about 5.5%. I've been watching it this morning. It's actually not changed very much. So I think it's kind of priced in that this was going to happen. That's 5.5%. I was on a 30-year bond. So that's maybe a bit higher than the 20 or 10-year rates that people often watch. You remember that after Liz Truss's budget, there was a big rise in gilt yields. I think the 30-year yield at that point was about 5.1. So we're, quite significantly above that now. But what's not happened quite as yet this morning, we're probably hostage to fortune in terms of when this podcast goes out. But last time I looked, it hadn't changed very much from Friday. So we're about 5.5%. Now, that's quite a bit more than other countries pay. So, France and Germany, probably somewhere below 4% that they pay on their debt. Why is it higher for us? First of all, I think there's an expectation of higher inflation rates in the UK. And partly that is due to some of the problems we've talked about before, which are things like the high cost of energy. We have the highest cost of industrial energy in the world, don't we? And the fact that we haven't improved productivity. If you improve productivity, that drives prices down, and we've not been able to do that. So we have higher inflation. If you have higher inflation, people want a higher yield on their bond. So if you have a bond and you earn 5% on it, but inflation is 3%, you're only really getting 2% from that bond. Because, the first 3% is eaten up by the fact that everything costs more. So your real rate of return is the difference between the bond yield and inflation. So the higher inflation is, the more people expect on their bond return. So the fact that UK inflation is higher is the reason why we pay higher rates than some other countries. Second reason, perhaps a bit more technical reason, is that a really big chunk of UK debt is owned by overseas owners. So, international banks and other governments and international investors. I think about 40% of our debt is now owned overseas. Depends on whether you include in the bottom line what the Bank of England owns or not. If you include in the bottom line what the Bank of England owns, it's probably only about 30%.
Okay.
So the fact that overseas investors own a lot of our debt means that they are very, you might call it hot money. So, if they can get a bigger return somewhere else, they move it around, or a better return somewhere else. So it's quite volatile. So, they are likely, if they have worries about the UK, to sell our debt. And if the price of debt goes down, the yield on it goes up. So the fact that there's a lot of overseas owners that has some impact on the yields we pay. If you look at it as for example, if you compare us to Japan, Japan's debt is largely owned in Japan.
It's massive.
And it's massive, bigger than ours.
Something percent of GDP.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's not such an issue.
Because people are willing to buy it. And one of the things that was an issue for a long time is that there's a question as to whether government can make banks buy UK debt. And certainly under the old EU solvency rules, there was a bigger requirement for banks to buy UK gilts than there is now. It's not that different, but it was a little bit different. And the third reason why we pay more for our debt is just because there's a big question mark over whether people think the UK is a sensible place to invest, or whether it's a bit too basket case, you might say, for people to choose to invest their money.
Mm.
So for all those reasons, we pay more in our debt than other countries do. So I'm just trying to get back on the narrative. We were talking about Burnham versus the markets, weren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems then that it's important for any leader coming in to make sure that gilt yields don't rise and rise.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of interested to know why, I think we've covered this before, but why Liz Truss was kind of turfed out of office when gilt yields were at 5.1% and now they're at 5.5%. And doesn't seem to be such a talking point.
Yeah.
But I suppose that a leader doesn't want gilt yields to rise, because then to do anything costs a lot, because if you want to borrow, it's going to cost a lot of money. The interest you're paying on your debt increases.
Yeah.
You said it's already, 120 billion, which is more than we spend on defence, more than we spend on education. However, these fiscal rules, a lot of people will say they put Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, in a bit of a straitjacket, because it stopped her from doing things that a Labour government might want to do.
That's right. So you're right that any incoming Prime Minister and incoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, because we might get a new one of those as well, who knows, will really want to make sure that they don't cause a really big spike in gilt yields. And just to go on your Liz Truss question, the real problem, I think, with Liz Truss was that bond yields massively spiked up very, very, very quickly. And there are some technical problems in the market that means that you kind of almost create a vicious cycle where the more they go up, the more people have to sell bonds. And when they sell the bonds, the price goes down and the yield goes up again. And so things kind of snowball out of control. And that was what was happening when Liz Truss was Prime Minister. Bond yields are 5.5 now, but they've kind of crept up slowly and predictably, and it's not been a big market shift overnight. They have just crept up to the levels that they're at now. So I think that's why it's not been as big an issue as it was when Liz Truss was in office. But you're right that it's a big question for any incoming set of politicians. How do they handle all this? And I do think there are ways that you can. I'm not saying Andy Burnham should come into power and just spend, and spiral markets out of control. That's absolutely not what you want. But I do think there are ways that you can build a narrative that says that there are some ways in which you can spend that are productive long term and will help the country, rather than just limping along as we are now. So this is where it gets a little bit technical, but at the moment, a lot of the fiscal rules and the OBR analysis, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility analysis, is based around a measure that's called Public Sector Net Financial Liabilities, PSN. Public Sector Net Financial Liabilities, PSNFL. It doesn't quite trip off the tongue, does it?
No.
Now, it's always seemed to me that that's a bit of an odd thing to measure. So, to give you an example of why it's odd, if government were to borrow £10 billion, say, and use that to build housing, let's say, £10 billion worth of housing, what that would do is it would add £10 billion to the measure, the Public Sector Net Financial Liabilities measure, but the £10 billion of assets that you as a government hold in housing doesn't affect the balance sheet. So in other words, that doesn't affect the way that the market looks at you as a country. Now that's a bit odd, because if you were a company and you did exactly the same thing, let's say it's probably a bit smaller, but let's say you're a company and you borrow £10 million worth of bonds, corporate bonds rather than government bonds. So you issue a bond, you've got £10 billion in the bank. You've got a liability of £10 billion. That's balance sheet neutral, because you've got £10 billion in cash, £10 billion on your balance sheet is a liability. Those cancel each other out. If you then use that £10 billion to build something, a factory or even housing, if you're a housing developer, that's still balance sheet neutral, because you've got £10 billion liability and you've got £10 million asset. And it's really odd that when you're looking at government, those same rules don't apply. So the way you would look at that, one of the ways that you assess the value of a company is you assess what you call its covenant. So, its ability to repay its debts. And you would say that borrowing £10 million and having an asset worth £10 million is probably positive on your covenant, because in terms of the money, the money's cancelled out, but you've now got an asset that's going to generate you income. And as long as you're generating income that's more than the interest you're paying on the debt, you've actually made the company worth more. You've strengthened its covenant. So why does that not work the same way for governments? Go on, you put your hand up. You have a question. Question at the back.
I've got maybe an answer. Is it that when you give the example of housing, it's very complementary to the metaphor of business, because we can sort of value a house very easily and say it costs this amount to build a house, this is what the market value would be. Whereas governments do things which normal businesses wouldn't do, and there's not a competitor. And so we were talking about HS2 a while back. You know, if you put 100 billion into HS2, I mean, what's the value of HS2? What's the value of that track? You can't just sell it as a government. That's not, you know, an asset in the way that a business would have an asset that they could just sell. Is that part of the answer?
Possibly, but, you know, businesses build infrastructure and then they have it on their balance sheet. Our water companies, when they build a reservoir, that reservoir's on their balance sheet. They don't say it's not worth anything now.
And is it on their balance sheet for the amount of money that they put into it?
Well, as long as they built it in a way that it was worth that.
But is that the problem? Because with something like HS2, because this is what I was thinking right from the start when you said about, we were talking about this right at the start. You said about spending money on something that's actually worth something rather than just, you know, wasting money.
Yeah.
But the problem is within a project that might seem like, I would say, you know, infrastructure, railway spending, that's a brilliant use of money. Yeah. And yet some of that will go to a planning application that's 3 miles long.
That's true.
Literally, if you printed it out, that's how long it goes on for. You know, 100, I'm trying to think of how much they spent now. I want to say it was 100 million on the Bat Tunnel. I might be way out, but a lot of money on something like the Bat Tunnel.
Yeah.
Some of that could be just completely frivolous spending, and it's all tied into a wider project that's hard to sort of distinguish.
That's true. And I think there are some, I mean, I used the example of housing. There's some specific issues on housing. So if you're government or if you're a local authority and you own housing, you have to sell it to a tenant under a right to buy scheme, and you suddenly lose that asset. So you no longer have it. So, you know, I think you do. That's, in my argument, a good argument for state ownership. That, you know, you shouldn't be giving away state assets. You should be able to have those assets on your balance sheet. And I mean, you're suggesting that it's not easy to value infrastructure, and to some extent that's true. But the way that generally a business would value that is how much income can I generate from it. They wouldn't look back at what did we spend on the Bat Tunnel. They would look forward at what can we charge customers to travel on this line, and what kind of an income will that produce for us, and is that more than the cost of the borrowing? And that would then add to the value of your business.
But I suppose it's not a direct relationship like that of the business and customer one. And, you know, something like HS2, the government would argue, even if it's not going to pay for itself in rail fares, it will in economic growth in different parts of the UK. So it becomes much more complex, right?
It does. I mean, I'm not saying these things are easy to value, but I mean, somebody who agrees with me that maybe there's better ways to do it is the IMF.
Okay. I thought you were going to say Andy Burnham, but okay.
Yeah, possibly he does as well. But the IMF...
The International Monetary Fund.
The International Monetary Fund, yeah, which does a lot of comparisons across different countries of how they how they assess their economy. And they say that they prefer measures that look at public sector net assets. So that look at, in that example I gave where you spend £10 billion building houses, you would look at the value of those houses as part of the balance sheet, the overall balance sheet of the country. And so you wouldn't say that, spending £10 billion on building houses makes you £10 billion worse off as a country. They would say that's neutral. Or even, you know, a good thing, because if you spent, you know, as we know, we spend so much on things like housing benefit, and if that housing stock is owned by government, we make savings there.
Would it lead to a government potentially making some claims like, we've spent £100 million on this anti-racism campaign, and that's an asset that goes on the books.
Yeah, so I think you've got to be robust in your measurement of these things. And perhaps one of the things that is quite a positive thing is that Andy Burnham seems to be building a bit of an economics team around him. So do you remember Andy Haldane?
Oh, yeah, familiar name.
Yes, he was the ex-deputy governor of the Bank of England.
Right, okay.
And he wrote some stuff that I've quoted as being really good about the real problem for the UK is lack of productivity. He talked about there's a long trail of businesses that are kind of just about managing, that are not producing productivity gains, and it's that long tail of very poor companies that are reducing overall productivity for the UK. So we like him. There's a couple of other people on his list. Jim O'Neill, don't know if you remember him. He was, I think he was an advisor to George Osborne. So, probably somebody you think of as a boo person. But, having him in your team, I think, will give the market some confidence that you're not going to just be profligate in public finances. Richard Hughes, remember that name? He was an ex-governor of the OBR, or leader of the OBR. I can't remember whether that's quite the right term, governor. I think he was the chair of the OBR. Now, on one hand, you might say, well, these are all people from the old economy, from, the old failed neoliberal state. But I think, you've got to be, as somebody who's got to give the market confidence, I think you probably have to have some of these people involved. And I think if you can use their knowledge to kind of really weave a compelling narrative that says, what we're going to do is we're going to not abide by those old fiscal rules, because we've abided by them for 20 years and they've not done us any good. What we need to do is develop a new set of rules that perhaps is a bit closer to what other countries do, that would allow us to spend in productive ways that really push forward our economy. And I think if you can do that, and you can also be really robust about it, so make sure that the things you're spending money on are really productive things, productive assets, and not the kind of things that you were suggesting. I think, you could persuade markets that you're heading in the right direction, while still at the same time creating space to do some of that perhaps innovative stuff that would allow us to start pushing forward infrastructure and, building the economy.
And therefore breaking the fiscal rules as they're currently laid out, but reassuring markets and giving them confidence that you have an idea of what you're doing with the economy.
Exactly.
Okay. And this may be what you want to give as an answer, what you've just said, but I was thinking, what would you say if you're Andy Burnham and you give your first speech at the lectern, and outside number 10, you've just been made Prime Minister? Like, what is the first thing you say? How do you give an outset of what your leadership would look like?
I think I would say something along the lines. I don't pretend to be as good a communicator as Andy Burnham, by the way. And I'm sure you'll say something far more rousing than this. But I would say something along the lines of, we can't just carry on doing what we've been doing for 20 years, because it clearly doesn't work. We've got to find a new way of building the economy, a way that shares the wealth around the country, isn't just dominated by London and the London outskirts, in a way that does rebuild our industry, in a way that gives people meaningful work, in a way that drives forward productivity. And that will mean some people making sacrifices. It will mean, for example, that some of the unproductive things that we spend money on now, we stop spending money on them. It will mean being clear about the fact that we need a functioning economy, which, for example, makes use of our North Sea oil, builds nuclear power so that we have affordable power to build industry and to heat our homes. And that does mean a paradigm shift from where we are now. And that will mean winners and losers. But we've got to have a national debate and a discussion that allows us to really cohere around a new man on the moon kind of almost mission that perhaps is that every person will have an affordable home. I mean, I could get on board with that.
I think that's a really good answer. I was going to give my answer, and now I don't want to. Mine wasn't as articulate as that.
Oh, well, that's good. I'm sure Andy will be working on it on the train down to London.
Do you know what I think he should say, regardless of like policy position? And you set out a really good sort of, I would say, and you know, us as Social Democrats, members of the SDP, we sort of believe in those policy principles which you laid out. But I'd say forgetting policy, I think what he should say is his first thing is this merry-go-round of leaders coming in, having a crack and then leaving, this charade that British politics has become, this ends now.
Great.
Right? That would be like, wow, okay. And make it clear that he's not in this for the prestige of being Prime Minister and for the status, and then to do it for a year and sort of go, okay, now I'll go and get a fancy private sector job, but that he really wants to turn the country around. And it would then, that's the interesting thing about that, would by assuming the position that he's in this for the long run, it would actually start to not make it about him, because then it would go beyond him and he'd say, it's not about me whether I'm Prime Minister for 10 years. It's about setting out a platform that can start to rebuild that political sphere where we can have really good, solid arguments being contested and then visions being carried out rather than this revolving door.
Sounds great. I'm sure there'll be a job for you in Andy's administration.
You're welcome to get in touch. I mean, I can always turn you down. If you're listening, Andy, then our advice, we are offering it to you for free.